Good afternoon, and welcome to the second of a subscriber series, online subscriber series from the Christian Science Monitor. I'm Mark Sappenfield. I'm the editor of the Christian Science Monitor, and I am thrilled to have with me, not here in the studio, but down in our Washington, D.C. office, James Fallows. We are going to be talking today about his book, which is called Our Town. He wrote it with his wife, Deborah Fallows. And it is a story that is an important story for all of us to read at this time when we seem to have so many divides springing up between us in so many different ways. Our Towns is really the story of what lots of people call flyover country, but it's the area of the country that lots of times gets overlooked by the national media. And lots of times when the national media goes in, they just send people in for parachute reporting, for short things. What James and his wife Deborah did is they went in and they really lived in those towns for weeks. They went back several times. And they told the story not just of the story that you hear so often from the national news media about how the towns are struggling or what's going on. They really looked into the hearts of the town, and they looked into the dynamism that those towns represented. They looked into the hearts and they saw what about those towns is vibrant, what about those towns is remaking themselves. And then that way he's told a story that's very different from what you hear in lots of the news media today. And that's what we're so excited to talk about today. What he did in going around was not just going from town to town. James is an aviator himself. And he actually flew from town to town with his wife. And so his story is not just the story of these towns, it's also the story of a journey across the country that really brings you along as a narrative. Unfortunately, we were going to be joined by Deborah today, but because of a family issue, she wasn't able to join us today. So our thoughts are with her. But we're grateful that you're here, James, and we can just get started. I wanted to, first of all,
I'm going to chime in to say
of
thanks.
course.
Good, Mark, because I'm a lifelong subscriber and reader to the Christian Science Monitor. I so much respect what you all have done over the decades and in recent years to try to concentrate on stories about the world and the United States that are different from just cable news type of views of the world. So it's a real honor to be here with you. Deb was going to be here. She needs at the moment to be with her mother in Florida. So Deb and her mother send their wishes, and I'll do my best to represent her.
Well, I'm sure you'll do great. And I did want to say one of the things that's occurred to me in reading your writings, and I hope this comes across in the right spirit and not as us claiming you or anything, but you strike me as one of those people who is a Christian Science Monitor writer who just happens to never have worked for the Christian Science Monitor. In that, just what you said is, I mean, we try to be solution-oriented. We try and bring insight. We try and move the conversation forward. And I mean, that's just what you've done with so much of your journalism over the years. You've worked at The Atlantic for 35 years in different places all over Asia. And it just feels like there's a synergy there, which is why I'm so excited to have this conversation, because it is, as you'll see from this book, it's I don't have the cover on it because it's all stained and dog-eared, and that's because it's a resource. And as for someone like me who's really trying to say, how can we move forward? This is really a resource, and I'm grateful for you doing the work.
I appreciate it. And again, I do feel this spiritual and intellectual and cultural symbiosis with the Christian Science Monitor. And the Atlantic for a long time was based in Boston, not far from your headquarters. So there was that, we've been on parallel wavelengths for a long time.
Great. So a little housekeeping before we just jump in. We're using the Zoom platform for this live online event. And if you're joining us by computer, you'll have the opportunity to send in questions you might have for Jim. What you'll need to do is you'll need to click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of this Zoom screen to bring up the Q&A box to send us those questions. And my colleague, Bren Frederick, who's off screen there, I don't know if you'll be able to see him, but he's going to help me try to get as many of those as we can to today. So we're just going to jump in, and we're going to start our conversation. As you have questions, Ben will do jumping jacks or something just to let me know, so we'll get those in. The first thing I wanted is I have read through the book, and I've got a lot of different ways we can go. But I was curious if you kind of just have, it's when you read it, it's so you're so in the moment when you're reading this, and then you go, oh my gosh, he was there 4 years ago for some of these places. So you'd have had time to kind of chew over this, and certainly a new perspective given how much kind of rural America and that part of America kind of rose up and changed politics in the 2016 presidential election. Do you kind of have, and you're continuing this, as you said, you're going to be going to Wisconsin tonight, so this is a constant program that you're doing. Do you kind of have any step back kind of indelible impression or kind of takeaway that, when you think this journey that Deb and I have been on, kind of this is what I take away from it. This is what kind of sticks in my heart or my head.
Thanks for asking that. And you're right in saying that there's a kind of, as a matter of craft, I know this is a literarily informed audience that's joining right now. As a matter of craft, our wonderful editor at Pantheon Books, Dan Frank, whom I've worked with for a long time, said that he really thought it was important to have the great bulk of this book be real-time narrative. What it was like when we got to Sioux Falls, South Dakota in the summer of 2013, what we knew then, what we didn't know, the way our feelings changed as we went through the Dakotas and Michigan and up to Vermont and Maine and then down in the deep South over the coming years. And so the book itself is meant in most of its content to be a real-time sort of documentary telling you what we knew when we knew it and what we learned as we learned it and how things changed as our perceptions changed. But obviously, especially after the 2016 election, we looked back and thought most of the places we went were places that eventually voted for Donald Trump. Most of those same places were ones where we had reported from 2013 onward the sense of traction, engagement, agency, intentional opening of communities to refugees and immigrants, finding ways to experiment with public schools and with libraries and with the public arts. And if Deb were here, she would be telling you about those things.
Yeah.
How can it be that the place we are describing is also the place that the national media is describing as being some kind of cauldron of resentment and bitterness and fear and all the rest? And the best explanation I can offer is a combination of these things. One is sort of the fluke circumstance of the 2016 election, where again, it was 80,000 votes, about one out of every 1,500 votes in the US going a certain direction in 3 states, in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, that made the result. A second is, I think, all sorts of other things I won't get into, but I think that another one was a disconnection in a lot of Americans' minds between national politics, which becomes sort of a cable news bound, symbolic, tribal, bitter, fear-driven part of life, and the rest of life, where people interact still in ways we'd like to think of as practical-minded and American and all the rest. And so places we saw in Western Kansas were simultaneously being very accommodating and flexible to their newly immigrant-heavy population while voting for Donald Trump. And they seem to occupy different realms of people's minds and consciousness and hearts.
Yeah, and that you've gone exactly in the direction that I was going to take us next. I don't know if you coined this or if it's just something that you've heard, but you repeatedly use the phrase in the book that I love, local patriotism, in the sense that patriotism you naturally think of being as something for the nation, but it's really kind of there is a national patriotism. But that patriotism that national patriotism we see expressed right now is very different from the patriotism you describe in your book as local patriotism. And just as one example, you mentioned Sioux Falls. There's a great example in your book of, this didn't play out exactly while you were there, but you were able to follow it throughout the narrative, of this young woman who was in the ROTC, who is Muslim and wanted to wear a hijab during a headscarf during her ceremony. And there was a big to-do out of this over, that was inappropriate and should that be done? And the way you present it in the book, it was a debate. And for a lot of times she was not going to be able to do it. But in the end, they found a solution. And I think if I remember correctly, she was able to do this. And I kind of contrast that with what's going on with kind of Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling with the national anthem that we see, where it's kind of some of those, it's the ability to express, it's not a one-for-one thing, but it's in the same universe in terms of, people feeling like their values and sensibilities are being offended. But yet, at this local level in Sioux Falls, they were able to, in the end, it was hard, but they came to a solution and they came to a compromise. They were able to kind of find something in the middle that worked. Whereas with the national conversation, as you said, it's so kind of concreted. I mean, you're kind of in these places. I just would be interested for you to talk a little bit about that nature of that local patriotism, and is that something that can percolate up as opposed to kind of percolating down? We usually think of that, Washington's hand pushing down. Can things percolate up?
So that is, you've asked astutely what Deb and I view as the central question in our lives and our efforts, and we think for the next stage of the nation's life. First, let me say something about different brands of patriotism, and then about how the local versus national impulses might balance out this stage of our national history. So Deb and I and our then kids, when they were little, spent a lot of our life outside the U.S. We spent probably almost 15 years living mainly in Asia, but in Europe for a couple of years, and in Africa we've traveled a lot, et cetera. So I've always been fascinated by the U.S., but a lot of it has been looking at the U.S. from the perspective of China, or Japan, or of Malaysia, or of England, or of Africa, or other places. And this has made me a sincere American national patriot in a particular way. I wrote a book after we lived in Japan called More Like Us. And in those days, in the late 1980s, the theory was Japan is really cleaning up industrially. The U.S. to compete has to become more like Japan. My argument was no, we need to be more like us, more open, more mobile, more flexible. And that was a kind of American patriotism and exceptionalism I was expressing, that the country that can give people from around the world a chance, the country where you can be born in any circumstances and in principle do anything despite all the barriers and cruelties and injustices of American history. The subtitle of that book, by the way, was Making America Great Again. So my version of national patriotism is a kind of inclusive, practical, optimistic, cultural approach that I think still applies at a lot of the local level in the U.S. And the local patriotism is people who say, it matters to me that the Greenville, South Carolina of 20 years from now is the best Greenville it can be, or the Hattiesburg, Mississippi, or the Duluth, Minnesota. And I will lend my efforts toward that. And I think, to go back to your central question, our hope is that if Americans can be reminded of this version of themselves that still exists, and they still recognize at the local level, we hope then that leaders, ideas, solutions, consciousness that does now exist at the local level can bubble up, as you say, as opposed to the seeping down of a sort of poisonous national tone.
Yeah. There was one point in your book that you were talking about Columbus, in this case, Columbus, Mississippi. And I was just struck by before I was the editor, I was the national news editor, and so spent a lot of time thinking about Congress and Washington, and I was the national news editor, during the height of the Tea Party and all, and, just the complete stasis in Congress. And you wrote I think this was your portion, not Deb's, but talking about Columbus, and you said public decisions in these towns didn't always turn out right. They weren't always fair in their effects and benefits. They weren't always free of special interest distortions. But compared with the big showdowns in national politics of the past few presidencies, or even most policymaking at the state level, what these cities had done to prepare for long-term challenges, to take advantage of new opportunities, and to minimize posturing was impressive. And what struck me was that it's like at the local level, you have the freedom to make mistakes. It's like you never suggested that anything that these people were doing was perfect. Far from it. I mean, they were casting around. They were in difficult straits, and they just had to do something. And it was someone of vision came and grabbed the town by the scruff of the neck and took it forward. And they screwed up sometimes. But it's like, I'm sure you're familiar with the book from Robert Putnam, Our Kids, talking about the state of education in America, and very much kind of his. What I took from that book was very much, in order to solve education in the United States, every kid needs to be our kid. And what struck me about the way you portrayed these towns was and I obviously from the title, these are our towns. It's like there's that sense of the us that exists in the town that didn't kind of exist when you go into these higher levels. And again, I'm curious. Obviously, you also have followed American politics. You've worked in administrations, and obviously during a very different time, during the Carter administration. But you point out Dodge City, Kansas. They put a perpetual tax increase on themselves because they know where the money's going and they know what it's going to do.
Right.
You talk about Holland, Michigan, where you have these. You talked about what is a public-private partnership? Well, it's what's happening in Holland, Michigan. When government and business recognize an our, an OUR, something that is bigger than each of them and is important to the community. Why do you think that breaks down between the local level and the national level? I'm not trying to have you give away kind of your conclusions, but it's so evident in your book and yet seems so lacking on the national stage. You kind of go, what happens between those two places?
I really, really appreciate your picking up on this theme, because it was one of the real discoveries for Deb and me. That the time we'd spent in DC, we become inured to the idea that our meant only kind of the narrowest and most tribal definition. It was the D's and R's and Senate. It's 51-49. It was gerrymandering House seats. It was taking money out of appropriations, in a pure trade-off way. And so to see people who felt the freedom to plan long-term, which can't really be done at the national level, although of course we need that. And as you say, to experiment, I will fess up for any readers of the book or potential readers that one of the people who looms, I think only one of the people who looms large in our narrative has come to legal grief. The mayor of Allentown, Pennsylvania.
Oh, yes, right, yes.
A really inventive guy. He was reelected for his fourth term last fall while under indictment. He's since been convicted on multiple counts of influence peddling. I think he's the only guy who has run into legal trouble since. But that's an experimental spirit. And the schools in particular, when in South Carolina and Georgia and Mississippi, we saw these experimental approaches. Why this has not happened in national politics at the moment, I don't have a simple answer. Partly it is, there have been times in our history where one party or the other has gone through movements towards its extremes. So by every objective measure, that's what's happened to the Republican Party over the last 25 years. The person who is now the Republican president and whom all Republican senators support is one whom many of them 18 months ago said they could not support, but he was not, they couldn't support him if he ran. And so there is something that's happened to the Republican Party at a national level that is contributing to this. The media in general have had an intensifying effect. So I don't know how exactly the disconnect occurred. And I think the job that we, Deb and I, conceive, and that we feel very much fellow citizens with you all, the Monitor, is finding ways to identify a different spirit and increase its chances of prevailing.
And we were talking before the show about. I'd like you to read a portion from your book, and we were talking. I asked you what portion you wanted to read, and it was the exact portion that was, I thought, really poignant for me, and I think it kind of fits into the conversation we're having right now in terms of what is it that might be able to burble up, or what is it that towns might be doing that might have kind of a longer, profound impact on where this country heads. So if you wouldn't mind just reading a portion there, that would be great.
This will just take a minute. This happens to be the last two paragraphs of the book, and it's followed by a checklist of things that cities can do to make themselves more successful, from community colleges to other approaches. But this is about sort of the national meaning. So, and I'm talking about the ways in which our problems right now resemble those of the original Gilded Age, back after the Civil War in the early 1900s, and saying, when the national mood after the first Gilded Age favored reform, possibilities that have been tested, refined, and made to work in various laboratories of democracy were at hand. After our current Gilded Age, the national mood will change again. When it does, a new set of ideas and plans will be at hand. We've seen them being tested in towns we never would have suspected, by people who would never join forces in the national capital, but who can work together at home. Their projects, the progress they have made, and their goals are more congruent than even they might ever imagine. Until the country's mood does change, the people who have been reweaving the national fabric will be more effective if they realize how many other people are working towards the same end. I thought frequently of what Philip Zelikow, a professor at the University of Virginia, said to me at the beginning of our travels. He said, in scores of ways, Americans are figuring out how to take advantage of the opportunities of this era, often through bypassing or ignoring the dismal national conversation. There are a lot of more positive narratives out there, but they're lonely and disconnected. It would make a difference to join them together as a chorus that has a melody. That is the American song we have heard. So our idea is that there is something larger that can be made of these now disconnected efforts and events around the country.
One thought I wanted to talk with you about from reading the book. I didn't get a kind of a conclusive sense of, so it's nice to have the author that you can actually ask him what was going through your head at this time, is kind of if you're looking at one of those things that might divide us and kind of interrupt that sense of local patriotism percolating up to the national stage, is a sense of trust. And obviously within Dodge City, when you spend that tax money, you know it's going to go to things within your city. You know it's going to be spent well. And if it's not spent well, you know the person who spent it, so you can go up and give them a piece of your mind. So why isn't that happening? Why is that trust not happening at the national level? And one of the narratives, there's a million reasons for this, money and politics, all that sort of thing. But one of the narratives is racial, in the sense that as the nation becomes more diverse and as minorities get more of a voice than they had in the past, that this creates tensions that didn't exist before. And one of the takeaways that you could take from the 2016 election is that you had for the first time kind of a white voting bloc that acted, according to racial interests.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't get a sense. I go back to the places where you kind of really delved most into issues of race and how they were shaping the community. I think of the Dodge City example.
Yeah.
And on one hand, you did get the sense from talking to there was a Latino official who felt like he was making headway, who had been brought here illegally when he was 13.
Yeah.
You did get the sense that they were making it work. But at the same time, there was also somewhat of an ambivalence or kind of an undercurrent there. There was the gentleman who said, of his opinion of how they should be dealing with illegal immigration. He said, someone might take out the tar and feather for me. So you could sense there was some resistance to what he was saying. And there was a question of, there the immigrant population is very much there meeting the need of the meatpacking plant. If they're educated and they have more of a voice, does that become more of a strain? What was the sense that you got in those communities in terms of is the racial issue, are they simmering below the surface and it just is manifesting itself on the national stage, or really was there a sense of harmony and making it work, and it just was a bipolar sort of thing, and how this was represented?
So that's another superb question. Thank you for asking that. And let me give you my diverse answers, which I hope will flow together like the tributaries to a mighty stream and take us towards the delta. Of course, the first background point is that racial difference, racial inequality has been the foundation of American history, of our many centuries of slavery, and that is, a reality every place we went. We spent a lot of time in Mississippi, Georgia, and South Carolina, where the racial past, especially in Mississippi, is something they're trying to reckon with, black and white, every day. Second, that while immigration has been fundamental to America's success in the world, in my view, it's never been problem-free. If you look at the history of immigration from the 30s or 40s onwards, whatever group was arriving at a given time, whether it was the Germans or the Irish or the Italians or the Greeks or the Eastern European Jews or whatever group you are enumerating along the way, the Vietnamese 30 years ago, there's always been short-term disruptions, short-term dislocation. What distinguishes the U.S. from most other countries is that it has generally been able to absorb this and make the second and third generation people feel as if, of course, they are Americans. They don't speak whatever language before. They'd like to learn it again. This is leading to my observation that at the local level, that process, as we observed it, is still going on. At the local level, people in Holland, Michigan, Betsy DeVos's hometown, which is now majority Latino.
Yeah.
Used to be all these giant Dutch people,
Yep.
and now it's now majority Latino. They are passing bond issues for their public schools.
Yep.
We have mainly a Latino population, and most places, and in Dodge City, as you mentioned, this guy Ernesto de la Rosa is this much beloved city official, even though he's there on a DACA waiver. And so we found that the pageant of American immigration, as you would see over the last 2 centuries, of never problem free, but basically successful, is what you would take from the American saga now. And the places where you have the most intense sort of build a wall bitterness are places where the immigrants aren't. Like Steve King, the congressman from Iowa, who's sort of the
Yes.
leader on this whole front,
Mhm.
his district is like 97% white. And West Virginia, which was the highest percentage state for Trump in voting, has the lowest percentage of immigrants of all the states. My home state of California, I think, shows the arc of this, where 30 or 40 years ago, in the time of Proposition 13, that was partly because a sense of the traditional white majority in California was thinking, who are these people taking over our public schools and raising our property taxes? It's probably been 25 years since California became a majority minority state. White Californians have not been a majority of the population there for a very long time. I think California has its problems, but you don't find any deep white anxiety among people in California. This is part of what makes California the most economically productive state in the country. So,
Spoken as a Californian.
yes, spoken as a Californian and a proud one. So I think that, of course, race is central to American life and politics. Of course, racial fear, all the evidence seems to show that was the main sort of swing vote factor in the 2016 election. But city by city, we contended that the process that's going on is continuous with most of American history, as opposed to being discontinuous in some kind of new Brexit style rebellion.
So what I need to be careful about is I can just sit here and ask you questions all day, but we do have readers. We have a question, and this is just also a call out to readers. We'd love to hear more questions, and I promise I will stop talking to allow you to ask them. So if you have questions, please send them in, and Ben will let us know.
Yeah.
Go for it.
This one comes from Laura Goodrow. She says, "Thank you for sitting down with the Christian Science Monitor to discuss your engaging book. I am engaged in doctoral research on certain aspects of rural identity, including what you and Dr. Fallows term civic engagement. My question is, did you get the sense that there were any differences between the motivation for civic engagement between rural towns such as Eastport and Ajo and larger cities such as Greenville or Duluth? Economic, a personal connection to a place, or something else?"
That's an excellent question. Again, thank you so much for that. And it is, you have also very graciously touched a sort of standing joke within our family. So the wonderful Deb, who is not here, is the only member of my nuclear family who has a PhD. And so we always address her as Dr. in linguistics. And my dad was a small town doctor. And so we always used to have the two Dr. Fallowses in the household, were my dad, Dr. James A. Fallows of Redlands, California, and my beloved wife, Dr. Deborah Fallows of right now of DC and Florida. So it's really interesting, the differences of scale when it comes to civic engagement. Two of the cities that you mentioned, and I'm glad you mentioned, are the smallest ones we went to Ajo, Arizona, a couple thousand people right in the far southern reaches of Arizona, so far south that they refer to themselves as having a tri-national region, U.S., Mexico, and the Tohono O'odham reservation that is right next to them, and Eastport, Maine, the farthest, the last city on the Maine coast before you get to Canada. That's also about 1,400 people. And there it's a matter essentially of, it's like you're on a submarine or a little ship. Every single person has to be engaged or the whole enterprise won't last. And so there, I think you only go there if you're ready to be part of the enterprise. And that is something that was quite striking and admirable. If you go up a level of scale to places like Greenville, South Carolina, which is a marvelous city. I had not been there in my long life until 3 or 4 years ago. Now it feels like my second home. That's 100,000 plus, But there, they have very deliberately worked to make a sense that the future of our Greenville involves people of different races and different nationalities and different language groups and all sorts of things. They've made themselves very deliberately, consciously inclusive. And I'll mention an illustration in a second, to have a sense of engagement, that people can feel the government is theirs, the arts are theirs. Here's the illustration I was going to give. The mayor of Greenville now is a Republican named Knox White, who's been there for 20 plus years or so. You will see him in the national news usually every 4 years when there's a Republican primary in South Carolina, and the Republicans are seeming as if they're kind of competing for what is seen as a right-wing vote in South Carolina. And so you'll hear Knox White quoted. Whereas within Greenville, his role is indistinguishable from that of any other big city responsible mayor who thinks he's responsible for all of his people. One of his predecessors was a man named Max Heller, who was a Holocaust refugee. And there's a big statue of Max Heller downtown in Greenville, saying, because he was sort of the architect of this beautiful downtown that Greenville has. And so I think places like the ones you mentioned of different scale have found, regardless of their scale, a way to create the sense that everyone is needed, that it's necessary, it's built into these tiny little places. And bigger places, my hometown of Redlands, California, now about 50,000, has tried to do that same thing, and bigger places too, big as Columbus, Ohio, which is a giant city. But they also try to create an idea that this is a city that needs you and where you can do things.
That's a great idea, and it also segues. It's funny. I was going to go to Eastport next too, so I appreciate the reader taking us there. One of the things that struck me about Eastport, and you've just kind of laid it out very elegantly right there. I hadn't really thought about it in those terms. I'd thought about it more in the terms of, it's like Eastport just collectively decided that they were going to tell better stories about themselves, to themselves. It's like, we are just going to decide that we are this, and therefore it shall be so. And it seemed almost by decree that the writing that you and Deb did there was very evocative, and just this fierce sense of pride and of will in a positive sense, for saying we are going to remake this town, and it's going to be done. And I don't mean to overstate the case here, but I know you're someone who likes to kind of wrestle with big ideas, so I figure you won't shy away from this. Is how much of, you think about the different towns that you go to, and Eastport is an example where, as you say, since it's so small, it's like everyone has become the civic booster. Mm-hmm. But you talk to other ones, and I'm forgetting the from Columbus, Joe Max Higgins, I think it was.
Yes, Joe Max Higgins.
And you go all the way down, and you mentioned this, and I think this was number 3 in your list of 10.5 takeaways. Is you say, who is the person who's the mover and shaker in here, and if the people in the town can answer that question, that's a good sign.
Yes.
But it's like someone needs to kind of take the town by the scruff of the neck and say, this is the vision for who we're going to be. And I wonder to what degree, obviously all the boosterism and the economic know-how is essential, but on one level it also seemed like it was also just a shift in thought that was needed. And I think about that from the standpoint of Erie, Pennsylvania too, where they talk about, the older generation had this view of Erie, and the younger people are saying, well, that's not who we are anymore.
Again, thank you for noting these parts too. If Deborah Fallows, PhD in linguistics, were here, she would say that she would describe what she wrote about language in Eastport, Maine, and the way that Linda Godfrey and some of her friends, who are known as the Women of the Commons in Eastport, the way they noticed that a lot of terms people were using to describe themselves started with D. Decline, decay, depressing, despair. You can go down your list of D things, and they decided to deliberately, that's a different kind of D.
Yeah, there you go.
Decide to intentionally use words, renew, revive, renaissance, repair, and all refresh. All the things that could put a different cast on life. Now, of course, there is such a thing as blind boosterism. This is the country that, after all, produced the concept of Babbitt and of used car salesmen and hucksters and all the rest. But I think that self narratives about people, about companies, about stages of history, about communities, about countries, they make a difference. In a lot of places we saw were conscious of having a negative narrative, either internal or external. West Virginia is very much aware of that. Mississippi, of course, Central Valley, California, which is essentially where I'm from inland California, Eastport, Maine, of Erie, being the places that people leave, the place nobody wants to be. In Fresno, where the California high-speed rail was being built, people from LA and San Francisco would say, oh, the train to nowhere. And people in Fresno would say, well, we're in nowhere. This is where we live. And so shifting the narrative, a lot of these places have made this a source of pride. In Fresno, they say, campily, but seriously, Fresno, yes. And in West Virginia saying, you think we can't do anything, we're going to show you what we can do. In the same Mississippi and other places. And so I think a self-narrative makes a difference in people's lives and in community lives too.
And in that way, what I thought was the real value of your book is it wasn't you didn't intend, at least to me, you didn't intend to go out and tell the full story of a place, in the sense that you really weren't talking about the past, and in some sense you weren't even talking about the present. You were talking about the future of that place and the future that these people were imagining, and just the idea that I lost my train of thought there, but that you were about kind of seeing the best of these people and how they see themselves. It sounds like we've got another question. So
yeah, Mark, you talked about people pulling people up by the scruffs of one individual, kind of pulling a community up by the scruff of their neck a little bit. Bud McKibben was asking, have you found that special interest groups have less of an effect in these towns than they have had nationally? It seems like sort of in line with, an individual or perhaps a group with a particular interest.
That's a very interesting question, another very interesting question, and which makes me think about things in a different way. In a lot of places we went, the people that were part of the solution could also objectively be described as special interest groups. For example, we were talking about Holland, Michigan earlier on, hometown of Betsy DeVos. Her family and a couple other big families there are the giant industrialists of that area. They have money from the Amway Corporation. They have money from various auto parts and auto supplies industries. And so on a national level, a lot of people like that have used their money in sort of special interest ways. But locally, they've been part of very intentional public-private partnerships. For example, a member of Betsy DeVos's extended family, I believe it was her father-in-law or uncle or something, came up with this scheme called the snow melt scheme, where he paid personally for the cost of piping waste heat from the city power plant in little plastic pipes underneath all the sidewalks and streets of the downtown to heat it in the wintertime. So a city that has 10 feet of snow in the winter has no snow on its downtown streets. And this was a giant turning point in the downtown. In my hometown of Redlands, California, Jack and Laura Dangermond, who are the big business owners there, have given a lot of money to civic reform. In Bend, Oregon, a big developer there has done things. And I think the interesting difference from this question is the sort of the narrowness or breadth of inclusiveness. That at the national level, we know there is a kind of zero-sumness to a lot of the intervention by these interests, where it's I'm going to get my tax break and you're not going to get it. I'm going to get my person into this job or into this court seat or whatever. Whereas for whatever reason, the local level, there is a more public sense of the public-private partnership. So that is an angle I have not thought through as much as I will, but it's very interesting of why groups that are objectively private special interests are able at the local level to work in a way that is more public spirited. And I don't know, but I will think about that.
And this is risk being presumptuous, but rather than answering the question, I would say, as a reader, one of the strongest impressions that I got from the book, and again, one of the reasons that the idea of local patriotism resonated with me so strongly, is I would say that the special interests that you saw operating throughout these towns, Jim, their special interest was the town. And that's what's so interesting about this disconnect we see between the national level and the local level, is that at the national level, when you say special interest, you immediately think, oh, manipulation, as you say, zero-sum game. But what your book showed so beautifully is that there kind of, in these towns that work, there kind of are no special interests. Of course, there probably are, but for the kind of, if you're talking about like qualitatively, look kind of the meta level for the town, or the gross level for the town, is all these people come together. And again, I come to that title you chose. It's our town, and so our special interest isn't having a nice place to live, and so they work together, and it's that dynamic that you kind of, it's like what I want, my humble request, Jim, is can your next book be called Our Country? And like, can you crack that nut for us? And then then you'll get the Nobel Peace Prize. And
let me note that down.
Yes.
Then Our World after that.
Yes.
So just to say something more about that, if I could, that is again, and I'll make it brings to mind two comparisons. One is, I'm thinking of a lot of these special interests, of big industrialists who in their own towns found ways to agree to pay more taxes or make more contributions or give up some more benefits just because they thought it was necessary for the welfare of everybody. Whereas in the national level, it's maximizing their own tax advantage. I guess the other is, I'll say one thing about the city of Pittsburgh. We didn't spend a lot of time there, but we were there briefly. A reason it has done as well as it has now is partly its universities, but they have a lot of locally based philanthropies from the original Gilded Age: Carnegie, Mellon, Frick, Heinz, which have an enduring local patriotism, and they made their money nationally and globally, but they give a lot of their money now enduringly for Pittsburgh. And that's one reason why Pittsburgh has this kind of quality of being a really successful city now.
As you might imagine from the conversations we've been having, basically, when I was reading through your book, I was constantly trying to say, how can we apply this? How can we apply this? So I was kind of going through it with the sense of trying to take lessons from it and figure out kind of mechanically, what are the breadcrumbs that we can take to go forward as a country. And one of the things that, as you said, when you and Deb were going to all these different things, you started hearing choruses, you started hearing echoes. You're just like, oh, I heard this in that town, and I heard this in that town. One of the things you said in many different places is, in towns that have a strong mayor system, you kept asking, do you have higher goals for office? And they're like, there is no higher goal than this. This is the pinnacle of politics right here, buddy. And what I found interesting is, obviously our national politics is not set up that way, and for reasons that I think all of us would say are very wise on the part of the founders. But in some senses, if you kind of look at the 2016 election, those who voted for President Trump were kind of saying, we want a strong mayor government. And this is an unformed sort of thing, but I just, since you're such an intelligent person and you like to kind of wrestle through these big ideas, I kind of just wanted to throw that out there and say, kind of, what does that say in terms of, on a local level, the kind of government that works best is when someone can come in and really take control of something. But I think we would all agree that on the federal level, that's probably not what we want to happen, but yet we kind of have that need for someone with a vision to step in and do something. So how do you measure the strong mayor versus the dictator sort of thing?
Yeah, that's another very interesting tension, and let me try to sort of whitewater raft my way through it.
Yeah, I kind of threw you under the bus there.
So a good thing about strong mayors under current rules, that is not the Tammany Hall rules of Boss Tweed or the previous Mayor Daley rules of Chicago back in the 50s or 60s, is there is regular accountability. Knox White keeps getting returned to office in Greenville, but people have to keep voting for him. Yep. And Don Ness and others in Duluth, when he was when he ran for re-election, he had no opponents because everybody was so happy with him, but he had to keep getting re-elected. So I think a strong system with accountability, I think, is a part of the strong mayor system that people would like to see. I think my home state of California is rethinking one of many sort of overzealous good government reforms that applied, which is term limits for a lot of its mayors. We write about Ashley Swearingen, who is a very effective mayor, a very effective Republican mayor of a city that has a large Latino population of Fresno, California, a lot of problems, who would have been elected on into perpetuity, but there's a 2-term limit there. So she was termed out. Another good mayor is there, but she couldn't stay in that job, even though the public would like her to be there. So I think the message is, number one, we hope general lessons, both as personal examples and as operational principles from this local success can burble up. But second, the main sense is effectiveness, power with accountability is something that would be the local lesson, that give these people some control, but know that you have to keep reelecting them, and you'll turn them out if you don't like the direction they're going.
And as you mentioned earlier, the mayor of Allentown, who was elected again and again, but is now headed to jail potentially.
Yeah.
So there's different ways of accountability.
Yes.
We have another reader question.
Yeah, we got a bunch.
Oh, great.
This one comes from an anonymous attendee, but you touched on the subject of California's lack of racial anxiety and the big economy. And I'm curious to know why the coasts are traditionally blue and the flyover states, which is literally what you did, are traditionally red.
It's another fascinating question. I'll stop saying that. Let's stipulate all these questions are great. What this makes me think is that when I was 20 years ago, we would have described California as traditionally the Republican base.
Yeah.
Recall that Richard Nixon, he was from California. Ronald Reagan was from California. So now in electoral college calculations, we start out saying, okay, 55 votes are the Democratic column to begin with from California, where Hillary Clinton, she didn't quite win 2-1, but it was something in that range in her victory. So California actually has changed dramatically in relatively recent history. And most people attribute it to the Republicans' error back 20 plus years ago under Republican Governor Pete Wilson in supporting a very tough anti-immigration bill, the so-called Prop 187, which was kind of that era's version of Build a Wall. And that it passed temporarily. It was thrown out by the courts, but it was part of a positioning of California politics of the of the Republicans as the party of essentially small town white people, and the Democrats as the party of everybody else. And so there's a kind of Democratic supermajority in California for a long time since then. On a national level, the axis that makes the coast I'm going to pause for a moment. Mark, you can vamp for 30 seconds while I drink some water.
Yes, please go. Yeah, I will say when I went out to California, I was a California correspondent for a while and came in kind of right after the impact of 187, and it was astonishing to see how quickly the politics in that state changed.
And so now I'm back online here. And so I think for the coastal difference is mainly that the biggest axis in American national politics now is by size of city. Essentially, all cities above about 100,000 in population vote Democratic. And the smaller the population, the more likely it is to vote Republican. Even the city of Dallas, for example, Barack Obama carried Dallas both times. Dallas had been a traditional sort of bastion of Republicanism. There's a long sort of analysis of why this is, that why urban life makes people Democratic and rural life has made people Republican, but it shows up in having the coastal big states being more, or northeastern and west coast states being more Democratic. I think that the challenge for the next wave of politics, if I were a Republican, as I am not, I would be thinking how to reposition the party so it's not simply a racially based older white rural party and the South, which is what it's becoming in its base, that is tenable for a given period of time with the way the House is districted and the rest, but it's sort of seen as a longer term losing hand, and it's bad for the country. And so the next stage in American politics, I would hope, is a sort of recasting of what is the Republican message to be appealing to people in cities, to be appealing to people of various races, et cetera.
And you have more?
Yeah, I got a number. If you were a younger man who wanted to...
An even younger man, I think. Is the way
is that possible?
It's, if you were a teenager... if you were a younger man who wanted to settle down and start a family and a small business, were there any towns that would be at the top of your list for this kind of move?
Great question, despite a shady setup.
That was my emphasis, and I'm very sorry.
So, yeah, a recurring question for Deb and me is, as we went from city to city, is why don't we live here?
Hmm.
Duluth, Minnesota. So I grew up in the desert of California, and I only saw snow once in my life before I went to college. So Duluth, there's a weather barrier for me. My wife Deb grew up in Minnesota, so less so. But Duluth is a fabulous place. You know, I would love to live in Duluth. Greenville, South Carolina, an objectively wonderful city. Wichita, Kansas has a lot of really appealing aspects. The idea in general of being a place where traffic is not a factor. You know, city by city, we thought, what's it like to only think of a 5 minute drive as opposed to an hour long drive? So there are one of the big themes we emphasize is people who are even younger than Deb and me, that is to say, people who are our children's age in their 30s, who are starting their families and starting their businesses, finding and saying they could work in San Francisco, they could work in New York, but the opportunities in Madison, in Fresno, in Bend, in Des Moines, in Moline, in Allentown, in Erie, in Charleston, West Virginia, in you name your list. Yes, the country, America is almost unique in having this diaspora of dozens and dozens of cities that have the amenities, the scale, the universities, the communication to be really fascinating places to raise a family and start a life. And the real estate is 1/5 the cost of the big cities. So go into the interior, young man, is my message.
Go inward, young man.
Yes.
Did flying and aviation, getting into these communities and accessing them by plane, did that change your impressions of them versus driving or even taking commercial airlines?
Read the book.
Yes,
Yeah.
I contend yes.
Yes.
And I contend that for several reasons. Number one, I love flying and always have, and it just is a uniquely beautiful perspective on life to see it from 2,000 feet. So I was really glad to be able to see the American continent that way. Second, there is a whole lot of America you can more easily see by general aviation than any other way. There are 5,000 small airports across the country. Almost any place you go is within 15 or 20 miles of a little airport, which is not true of big airports or scheduled airline flights. And number three, I would say you understand a lot of sort of the natural history of a town by approaching it. The last 50 or 80 miles of low altitude approach really tells you how it fits into its landscape. Is it a certain bend of the river? Is it where the falls are coming out of the mountains? Is there a pass nearby? Is it in the middle of where railroad junctions are? Why is the city where it is? Also, you can see what things is a city hiding. You can often see things that are visible from your sort of drone footage altitude as you come in that you can tell there's no big roads around. There's a little winding road that goes out to the prison, or there's a little there's an area where they have 2 million junked cars, but no one can see it because there's hedges all around there. So you see a lot of kind of these secrets of towns for good and bad by flying in. So yes, everyone should be a pilot.
And sorry, I didn't mean to be flippant in my response to the reader. I just meant that Jim and Deb both do a really evocative job of saying what it's like to see the country from the air and how that shapes your opinion. So if you're actually really interested in that question, I would just say to the reader, the book will be a very rewarding experience.
Yeah. This question comes from Nan Hilliard. How would you have been received in those towns if you were not educated or white, and which is to say, would a non-white reporter have been shown a different aspect of those cities?
So I promise I wouldn't say good question anymore, so I won't say that, but I'll say a serious and impossible to answer question. I'll give an indirect answer for one moment. I lived in Japan, our whole family lived in Japan for several years. I actually wrote a story for The Atlantic saying that every white American, especially every white male American, and especially every white educated male American, should live in Japan for a while to have a feeling of being in an environment where your race is an inescapable part of your identity every second of the day. Of course, as a white person, a race is part of my identity, but a part of the privilege of being a white American is you can think, oh, well, my race isn't the most important thing about me, which is not the experience of sort of daily life in Japan, which is a very, very ethnically conscious place, to put it in polite terms. So I cannot, there isn't a way I can fully imagine what it would be like to be there as other than a mature white person. Something that was important in Deb's and my self-presentation is we both think of ourselves as being smaller town Americans. We are based now in DC. I've worked for the Atlantic forever and ever, but my identity is a guy from a small, originally agricultural town in California, and Deb's identity is from a small lakeside town in Ohio. And that's where she lived after Minnesota. So we tried to approach people saying, we know towns like yours, and it's impossible. I'm sure it would be different, and it's impossible for me to itemize that. But we tried to talk with people of all different ethnic groups and economic classes, just doing what reporters, the only thing reporters can do to make up for their own, the things they can't know by their own identity.
Very good. I guess we're down to our last question. I think, I don't know, I hope this isn't too much of a curveball, but there is something I've been longing to get in that is not specifically about the book, but readers of the Monitor will know that these kind of political times have made me kind of dig into the legacy of nonviolence that was left by the civil rights generation and before. And I know from the beginning of the book, you said back before you were with the Atlantic, you worked for a civil rights publication in the South. And I just was curious if you kind of can go back to kind of tap that part of your memory. Some people, I remember there was a Smithsonian article that kind of called the civil rights activists kind of America's second founding fathers in terms of the way that they operated on principle and ideals and kind of built around that. And to me, that's so much of kind of what's needed right now is an elevation of the discourse to a level that's about what really matters. I just was curious if you could just kind of finish off by kind of telling about what that experience was like, and if it does kind of give you any resonances or inform kind of what you look at what we're going through today.
Thank you very much for asking that. And so the backstory here is, again, I grew up in this town in California that was roughly 50-50 Latino and white, with a very small Black population or Asian population then. So I was familiar with one kind of racial diversity. I went to college in the East Coast at Harvard, which is a completely different experience for me in the late 1960s. And during the summer of 1968, when I was 18 years old, I worked for a summer as a reporter for a newspaper called the Southern Courier, which was based in Montgomery, Alabama, and its coverage was the sort of civil rights movement in Mississippi and Alabama. And I covered a lot of sit-ins and marches, and I sold ads. I was a photographer. I was a reporter. I was doing everything with people who were being sort of beaten up by police and all the rest. And that was my witness in real time to how people were putting their lives and their consciences on the line. This was a month or two after Martin Luther King was assassinated. And it was in the aftermath of that and during the riots at the 1968 Democratic Convention. It was because of that and sort of experiences afterwards that I actually ended up working for Jimmy Carter in his presidential campaign, in 1976, and then for him in the White House. The connection there is that while Carter obviously is a white Southerner, and while his 1970 campaign for governor was seen by some as sort of playing to George Wallace type white sentiments in Georgia, certainly by the time he was governor and obviously when he was president, he very much bore the mark of being a deeply religious person who had thought seriously about the civil rights change within his lifetime in his home county, in his home state, in his home region, and the whole country. And he felt as if, John Lewis was a very early supporter of his. Carter had honored Martin Luther King when Carter was governor of Georgia, which was a radical thing for a governor of Georgia to do. I believe he put his portrait in the Georgia state capitol. And so I think that whenever anybody says that the strains of this era are the worst in American history, they are not. The Civil War was obviously different, but in 1968, when Martin Luther King was assassinated and Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated, and there were in dozens of American cities, there were riots with the National Guard shooting people, and it was a sense of whether Black Americans would have the vote and have the right to vote. That was a worse time, but there were people who did braver things to try to bring the country to a better version of itself. And so I think the strains now are serious and they need to call out a better sort of bravery and consciousness and leadership. And I really respect, Mark, what you and your publication and your community have been doing to call the country to that better version of itself.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming and joining us today. I really enjoyed that. I'm sure our readers enjoyed it very much too. And you're welcome back anytime. So just to finish up, there's just a couple housekeeping notes. Just again, James Fallows, writer for The Atlantic. His book is Our Towns. It's published by Pantheon and is co-authored by his wife, Deborah. If you've subscribed to this online event, we'll be sending out a follow-up email about where and when you can view a video replay of this event on YouTube. If you enjoyed this event or have questions, please email us at events@csmonitor.com. That's events, EVENTS, @csmonitor.com. We also invite you to subscribe to our free weekly books newsletter at csmonitor.com/newsletters. That's csmonitor.com/newsletters. And the live online event was produced by Greg Fitzgerald with technical support from Morgan Anderson, Ian Blackier, and Jeff Turton. Bailey Bischoff was our production coordinator in Washington. Along with my colleague Ben Frederick, thanks so much for doing this. This program was a production of the Christian Science Monitor.